The strategic battles in the Hungarian Grand Prix were absolutely fascinating, and it felt like 2021 all over again, with Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton putting on a masterclass between them. There is so much to talk about in this Hungarian Grand Prix, but here are my 3 winners and 3 losers. As I touched on before, we can't really look anywhere else for our first winner in the Hungarian Grand Prix without looking at Max Verstappen. He was absolutely sublime, starting off in 10th place, had a little bit of a problem in qualifying, but then really got it together in the Grand Prix and put on an absolute show for the Hungarian crowd, ending up winning and finishing 8 seconds above Lewis Hamilton, who ended up in 2nd place. That means that going into the summer break, he now has an 80-point lead in the Drivers' Championship and is looking pretty much guaranteed to win that championship at this point. I think it's fairly safe to say. And the reason that he looked so dominant in Hungary for me was down to 2 things. First of all, obviously just his driving ability, but I think the 3 stints over the course of Hungary really do show the 3 different aspects to Max Verstappen that just make him this perfect driver in Formula 1 right now, and obviously why he is a world champion, possibly a 2-time world champion by the end of this season. The first stint, he obviously started from 10th place and had to use that time wisely, making sure he kept hold of the tyres, but also was scything through the midfield pack, had to get in front of those Alpines, had to make sure he was in front of Lando Norris. He had to put himself in and amongst the mix with the Ferraris, with the Mercedes cars. Otherwise, he would have just been left behind. And if he wouldn't have been able to get past those Alpines, it would have been a much different race. Then came the second stint, where he was still battling, but in a very different way. It was more of a battle of attrition, making sure that he held onto those tyres, obviously passing Charles Leclerc twice during this stint, and making sure that he was putting in those lap times every single time around, that when the other guys around him stopped, when the Ferraris, when the Mercedes dropped into the pit lane, he was going to be able to take advantage of that and be able to come out on top of them. And then in the final stint of the race, when he did get into that position where he was in the lead of the Grand Prix, he absolutely just blew people out of the water. He was putting in some incredible laps, flying away into the distance. And to be honest, once he got into the lead, he never looked back. The second thing for me was strategy, which was absolutely key when it came to the Hungarian Grand Prix, and we'll delve into some people who didn't quite get the strategy right, but Red Bull just absolutely nailed it. Every single lap felt like it was purposeful. Every single stop was timed to perfection. It just released Max Verstappen into the Grand Prix every single time with as much space as possible, trying to get him as many laps as possible in clean air, and it just worked every single time. And even with a spin at turn 13, no one came close to the Netherlands driver, and he more than deserved this victory. Moving on to our first loser, though, and it has to be Charles Leclerc for me, and in a race that became so strategic, we probably should have known. At one point, it looked like Charles Leclerc was basically guaranteed the victory in Hungary. He got in front of George Russell on pace, and then it all fell apart when Ferrari put him on the hard tyres. In the cold conditions, the tyre warm-up on the hardest compound was almost impossible, and to be fair, many teams tried the hard tyres, and no one succeeded in making them look quick. I think that the Ferrari team thought that they could sort of buck the trend here and make the hard tyre work, but even Binotto said, our car was not as expected, it was not behaving well. And because he was so slow on those hard compound tyres, Ferrari opted for a really late stop for Charles Leclerc, swapping onto the soft compound tyres, dropping from 3rd place to 6th place in the race. But even on those soft compound tyres, he wasn't able to really get them going, didn't really show much pace, was often on the radio asking if the car was okay, and never really got close to Sergio Perez in the end, finishing last in that top 6 battle. Even leaving Leclerc saying, I don't know what they were thinking about his strategy team. But I feel like I talk about Ferrari falling apart pretty much every week at this point, so let's move on to our next winners. And to be honest with you, this could have been either one of the Mercedes drivers. They both had incredible weekends in their own separate way. But I've decided to go with Lewis Hamilton as my second winner from the Hungarian Grand Prix. Let's not skip over the fact that George Russell obviously picked up his first pole position in Formula 1, and it was a sublime lap from Mr. Saturday. But Lewis Hamilton on the Sunday, just wow. Lewis Hamilton picked up his 6th podium of the season and his 5th podium finish in a row, meaning that now in the 2022 season, Lewis Hamilton has been on the podium more often than Charles Leclerc. And let's face it, his race pace has been there all year, but his qualifying has been a little bit off, and sometimes that's meant he's been stuck in traffic and unable to overtake in these Grand Prix. But over the last few races, and specifically in Hungary this weekend, he's just been released. Had an absolutely great start, getting up into the top 5 very quickly, making sure that Fernando Alonso and Lando Norris were dealt with, and then just putting in fastest lap after fastest lap. And every single time he was in free air, he was by far and away the fastest car on the track. And I think this race just showed us again why Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen are held in such high regard in Formula 1 right now. If you give them the right car with the right setup, those two are just absolutely untouchable. Whereas my second loser, it seems like he's getting more and more valuable with every single race. I've gone for Sergio Perez because that Red Bull car is just drifting away from him this season. First of all, dropped out of qualifying in Q2, only managing an 11th place start, but actually started beside eventual race winner and teammate Max Verstappen, who was in P10. Got himself up into the top 6 fairly quickly, and to be fair, that's where the Red Bull should be. But of that top 6, he was by far and away the slowest of the bunch. And it feels like as the Red Bull has developed over the course of the season, Sergio Perez is just getting slower and slower and slower. And I completely understand Red Bull wanting to make the car quicker for Max Verstappen. He's top of the championship right now and definitely wants to pick up as many wins as possible and win this championship as soon as possible. But every time they develop the car, they're making it a little bit more pointy, a little bit looser in the rear end. And this is the complete opposite to what Sergio Perez wants in a car. And now it's starting to show every single time around where Sergio Perez just does not have the pace. And yes, I know Red Bull have nearly 100-point advantage going into the summer break in the Constructors' Championship, but they can't just forget about Sergio Perez, especially because he is going to be there next season as well. And if the car still doesn't suit him, they're not going to be able to battle in the Constructors' Championship again. We've seen with the likes of Alpine, if you have 2 drivers in this fight, it's a lot easier than having 1. Talking of next season, though, a team that has already dedicated themselves to 2023, my final winners of the weekend were Aston Martin after picking up another point in Hungary. Don't get me wrong, Aston Martin have been absolutely nowhere near where I expected them to be this season, but over the last couple of races, they picked up 10th and 11th place each time around, just meaning that they're creeping up on those points positions more often than not. And I think I even said it on stream, how on earth is it that Lance Stroll is always in 10th place when it comes to like lap 30 of a Grand Prix? Also, the replacement of a retiring Sebastian Vettel with a Fernando Alonso signing came out of absolutely nowhere for me. But I think this is a really big pickup for Aston Martin. Firstly, I think on current form in 2022, Fernando Alonso is a little bit of an upgrade on Sebastian Vettel. But secondly, you are weakening an Alpine team that you want to be battling next season. And yes, okay, Piastri is basically guaranteed to come into Alpine right now, so they have a replacement ready and raring to go, but is Piastri going to be on the level of Fernando Alonso straight away coming into his first season in Formula 1? I personally don't think so. Which leads me on to my final loser, and a man who also left the Alpine/Renault setup fairly recently is Daniel Ricciardo, who just lost the strategy battle. Because he started off in the top 10, he qualified in 9th place, which is his best qualifying position since Canada. But off the start line, lost straight out to the Red Bulls. Fair enough, you let the Red Bulls finish up in front of you, but needed to hold on to the back of the Alpines for me, especially because Valtteri Bottas had dipped out, meaning that he was holding on to 10th place. Then they went from soft tyres on the first stint, medium tyres on the second stint, to hard tyres in the final stint, and everybody was struggling on the hard compound tyres. Why McLaren still opted for the hard compound, I will never know. Luckily, Lando Norris was already clear in 7th place, or he might have been under a little bit of pressure from the Alpines, but Daniel Ricciardo was left as a sitting duck and ended up finishing 15th. And after a couple of points finishes in a row from the Australian, this was his 2nd worst finish of the season. Just to round it out with some honourable mentions for winners and losers from the Hungarian Grand Prix. Lando Norris was an obvious winner, driving by himself for the entire Grand Prix. He was clearly the 7th quickest car, but by a huge margin. He was nowhere near 6th and nowhere near 8th. Haas looks set to be a winner this weekend, bringing their first upgrade of the season to Kevin Magnussen's car, only for him to do a Canada and break his front wing on the first lap, ruining his entire race. Definitely a loser. Gasly finds himself in this weird middle ground this weekend, had absolutely brilliant race pace, but was never ever going to get anywhere near the points after a terrible Saturday and a new power unit meant that he was starting from the pit lane. That just about rounds up my winners and losers from the Hungarian Grand Prix. Leave a comment down below of your main winner and loser from the Hungarian Grand Prix. Maybe steer clear of Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc. It's being a little bit repetitive at this point, isn't it? But whilst you're down there, leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you are new, and I will see you next time.
We just need to get better at putting everything together because it always felt like there's something going wrong.